Hello, everyone. This is Chris Pariaszewski from SkyHub. We are recording from Silesia in Poland. We have amazing topic to discuss today, but more importantly, we do have amazing panelists with us. So let me very briefly walk you through our agenda for today's session. We have 60 minutes scheduled, and I hope you will love it. Very quickly, I want to navigate ourselves through the agenda for today's session. So first of all, I would love our speakers to introduce themselves briefly. And then we have three topics. I would, as a host for you today, I would love to ask you these following questions with some sub-questions to be more specific. And the last portion, we're gonna have an open free-form panel where we're gonna discuss in a free form, plus we're gonna have time for questions from the audience. And anytime you do have questions from the audience, please free to use the Zoom chat feature, and we will be happy to answer those if there is enough time. All right. So the first introductory section will be the speaker's introduction. So maybe I will ask Vikram that you briefly describe your research background, what you're working on right now, and what is your biggest goal in your work.
Hi, everyone. I'm Vikram. I'm a first-year PhD student at MIT in computational and systems biology. I'm broadly interested in machine learning and structural biology, especially as applied to drug discovery. Currently, I'm working on a research project focused on machine learning for phage-assisted continuous evolution, which is a method of designing proteins experimentally. And the goal of this project would be to more efficiently design proteins that cannot be designed in the lab.
Amazing. And you are based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So you are in the United States, and you started around 1 year ago, the PhD at MIT. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm just finishing up my first year now.
Amazing. So the second speaker we have with us is Ilya Brodsky.
Thank you, Chris. So my name is Ilya Brodsky. I am with Pine Biotech. Our company provides solutions for big data integration, and one of the focuses for us is to enable research using computational tools that are more effective in the hands of people that know how to use them well. So we also have a training component and a research component, and we're involved in a number of different projects with biotech companies and university research labs to help them get more out of their data.
Amazing. And you're also based in the United States. However, your background is a little bit from Israel. Is that the case?
Yes, I have a background from Israel. I was actually born in Russia, moved to Israel, lived there for a long time, comparatively. Then moved to the US not so long ago. And now I live here in New Orleans, in Louisiana, which is not a typical place where you would find a computational biology company. However, we live in a digital world, and so that enables me to live here comfortably with my family.
Amazing. Thank you for that. And we do have Nick Lynch from Carlef Research, and Nick also worked with AstraZeneca for 13 years. Is that right, Nick? Can you add more to that?
Yes. So thank you for the invitation today, and looking forward to the discussion. So yes, I spent several years at AstraZeneca running informatics groups and integration projects. Left there to start our company called Curly Research, which is a bird that you find in the UK and elsewhere. It's a wader bird. But we particularly focus on the data aspects of AI, and I did a lot with the Pasteur Alliance in the past, running their sort of strategic area of AI, but we're very interested in fair data, and we see data as the real feed-in to be able to make AI successful.
Amazing. And how is UK at the moment?
It's hot weather for once, and we're just coming out of our lockdown, but who knows where that's going to head.
Yeah, hopefully we're gonna find some solution, maybe today or as humanity in general very soon.
I think we just need sensible politicians, probably.
Doesn't apply for machine learning, I guess, yet. So I feel I also should present a little background from my end. So my name is Chris Pariaszewski. I live in Europe, in Poland. I do run a group of companies, which is a software services company, Skygate, and a venture builder, Sky, that runs a couple of products startups, super early stage companies that we're trying to build ourselves. We also do have a collaboration with a local university that's very strong in both data science and life science, and they also do have a research project where they combine those both disciplines. So this is the background, the supporting partner that we do have, very close to our office actually. Very interesting topic, I guess, through the entire pandemic situation, more and more people started to consider life science to be crucial for solving the very immediate problems that we do have as humanity. And my background, of course, is from the computer science, mathematical, and data science. So all the questions I'm going to ask you today is from the person that is a non-biology, non-chemical background person. I will try to understand and ask you from the perspective of a data scientist, what is the domain, what are the challenges, what is the potential application of machine learning toolset for this, etc., etc. Hope you will find it interesting. So the first question I have prepared for today, feel about this like a group of questions, is basically, is life the new data in data science? So of course, there is this discipline and industry called life science, and there is data science. So can we say that all the biological information thought of as a data that is now applied into data science models? And I do also have this hub questions, like, can we think of bytes? If bytes are zeros and ones, can genes be thought of A, C's, G's, and T's, and everything else from the data science perspective remains the same? Is there any application for image, language, and time series or 3D structure processing that we do know from the machine learning world? What are the data sets actually? What about the computing power? How much computing power actually is needed? And maybe the last sub question in here about the career path. Feel free to answer just the selection of this. This is a very broad question. I do understand that. And if that's possible, I would love to start with Vikram.
Sure, thank you. So this is a very broad question, so I'll focus on some aspects of it and just point out that there are lots and lots of resources available online if you want things like data sets that are relevant for the life sciences or to better understand life sciences data. A lot of that is freely available now. So there's been a revolution in the life sciences in terms of the amount of data that's available. And this really started with the sequencing revolution that happened in the 2000s when we went from having a very hard time sequencing small genomes to basically being able to sequence genomes for exponentially decreasing costs. And most biological data that's available today is either sequencing data or sequencing data that's being processed in some form so we can infer something else about a system that we're interested in. There are, of course, other forms of data available, like microscopy image data or imaging data that reflects other clinical conditions, and those can also be used in various data science applications. So there's a lot of data available. The key question is essentially, what do you do with the data that's relevant from a life science perspective? And I think here it's important to think about questions that are framed from a biological perspective, so being important biologically, and then move to what data is available and see maybe what data do we need to gather and how would you best tackle those questions from a data science perspective. It's really important to make sure the motivating factor is always from the biology or from the perspective of drug discovery, because if you don't do this, you might end up solving a problem that biologists don't actually care about, and then your work doesn't mean anything anymore.
Yeah.
Sorry,
just a very quick follow-up to that. So what I do also in my quick slide. So as probably you're familiar with a platform named Kaggle, and I recently found out a platform called, forgot the name, but there is a
Dream Challenges, they're called.
Yeah, the Dream Challenges is actually one of the challenges that exists on this platform. If I remind myself the name, I'll put in the comments. So think of it as a Kaggle for scientists, and there is competition, and some people from China won recently, with a person from Poland, a good friend of mine, was a second place. However, it sounds like it's very similar to Kaggle. So from your perspective, what are the differences and how more challenging is to participate in such life science combined with data science competition versus just Kaggle, because probably many of colleagues of mine, they will be interested in looking for challenging competitions. So is that a very good way to get into this combined field, multidisciplinary field?
Well, I believe Kaggle has hosted its own life sciences competitions as well. I'm pretty sure there was
Yes,
a chemistry-oriented one on Kaggle a few years ago.
correct.
So it's a start if you want to get your hands on some data that might be more difficult to get otherwise, and if you want to start trying out things. It is also very different from actually working in the field, because a lot of the key steps, understanding your data, data curation, those are all taken care of by the competition because that's already done. And the whole cycle of deciding what problem you want to go after and then thinking about how you might experimentally validate your models or what your models impact would be on the real world, that's all not a part of Kaggle. And that's something that really requires domain-specific knowledge about whatever particular model you're building.
So here, as a very quick follow-up question, your background, you're coming from chemical background, if that's correct, and you earned the data science later on. So you transitioned from the
I
domain.
wouldn't say that.
Okay, so what's your career?
I'm a PhD student, so I'm defining my background right now. But I did my undergrad in math and physics, actually.
Okay.
Picked up machine learning on the side there, along with chemistry. And then I did a one-year master's program at Cambridge and a year at Google that was focused specifically on machine learning for chemistry and drug discovery. So my background is more mixed between both the machine learning / data science side and the chemistry and biology background.
And it started with maths and physics, not with chemistry in your case. Oh, okay, so that's an interesting story. So it's possible to turn to this domain as well.
Yes.
From the mathematical background. Amazing. So if that's fine, let us ask Elia the same question. So is it a good time right now to get into the life science with combination with data science, and why it's now, if it's now, or like, is it really the tool to solve problems already, or was it still a very, very early phase of it?
No, I think it's an excellent time to be interested in life all the time. I think that we learn a lot from the data that is available. I would add on to what Vikram mentioned, that there is a lot of data out there. A lot of data is not really good. Technical batch effects and all kinds of artifacts that you probably need to be aware of. And that is also why you need to understand the technologies that generate this data. You need to understand experimental design. You need to understand where it came from. A lot of the data is very different. Some of it is based on lab experiments that are very controlled. Some of it is coming from patients. So there's very different types of data. And I think that's kind of like your standard big data definition, right? The variability, the volume, all of those things, they're really, you can see it in life sciences growing really fast. You asked about these competitions. So again, like Vikram mentioned, somebody did a lot of work for the competitions, and they actually selected the question to ask and defined it technically really well for somebody else to be able to apply what they know about data science with minimal understanding of the background and the context. Now, how much of that would you actually need to know individually before getting involved? I'm not convinced that you need to know everything there is to know. You have to get a PhD in some kind of life science domain, but you definitely need to come at it with some humility, which I think is lacking in the data science community. Data science community, if we can solve market predictions, why can't we solve protein folding, right? So I mean, it does not work like that, and I think that this is a domain that is highly specialized. The more we learn about data, the more we discover how much detail is possible to extract. And so there is a lag between the amount of data that is being extracted from this exponential growth of data availability and the actual, kind of information, useful information that is getting out of there. And the usefulness is also defined in many different ways. So usefulness, as Vikram mentioned, for biological questions. There are questions about clinical use. Drugs are discovered to work in an abstract field of biology, even if it's at the cellular and level, but in patients, it works, very different. So all of a sudden you have the systems component. Every person is a whole system of organ cells and different types of cells, right? So it's another level of complexity. So I think that's what I would say is one of the major challenges beyond biology is also the translation of these biological insights to real world applications where the data is much more messy than in controlled experiments. And so because of that additional level of noise, variability, it's also important to understand the context. How is this actually going to be produced? I mean, we saw this with vaccines, right? Production, delivery, actually how individual patients respond, right? So I think actually the pandemic has highlighted the usefulness of the data, the availability of the data, but also the challenges to translate the insights from this data to actual practice.
As a follow-up question, I would mention that typically the data scientists, they do not see how much it takes to prepare these data sets. My very, very little background is that I was helping to organize 3 hackathons. Every time we need to prepare the data sets for the competition. So that was very, very time consuming. And the contest itself was very quick and building models was like a luxury. So how do you actually design the entire process? If you are a big pharma company, so you need to have a team that is producing data in a standardized way, so it's less messy. What is the full, if machine learning is just the top of an iceberg, what is, in a very short description, the best practices to prepare the entire pipeline for building a new drug? You just rely on existing data sets, or you produce data for yourself? How does it look to build a data set that can be then applied to solve a real problem from yours?
I can try and help answer that. Really just re-emphasizing what Elia and Vikram has already said, that this is a long journey, and it's something that's been happening bit by bit over decades. I think that the one thing I really want to sort of mention is that computational activities have been going on in drug discovery for decades, and it might not have been called, it was certainly aspects of machine learning precursor to where we are to now. But I think to point out the issue of how do we make this data accessible and available, it's about really at the top level, it's about managing the data lifecycle. So the key here is thinking about where you create your data, and that data can both come from inside your own labs if you're a biotech with your own labs, but equally if you're coming at it from more of an in silico approach, then you're wanting to collect data together. And as has been mentioned already, there's lots of data out there. Some of it's public, some of it you have to pay for. And it's all about balancing. If you're running experiments to prove a particular point, to disprove or prove a particular theory, then you're trying to combine that with other data. And really, it's going to be, as you build out that data lifecycle, nowadays we spend a lot more effort. And that's why the FAIR initiative has become so popular. And FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. That really is why FAIR and AI go hand in hand, because you have to think about the data before you're using it in a machine-based approach, and machine-based approaches work much better with identifiable data that's linked together with an ontology, with a consistent vocabulary, for instance. So if you're starting afresh, then it's good to start using the FAIR principles as best you can. But if you're having to blend together new and old data, then it's about trying to map some of your old data to your new data so that they can become comparable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. So it sounds like you need to design the entire process from scratch. So the old school drug discovery without AI or machine learning was different, but now in order to really utilize the power of machine learning, you need to design the entire process, the entire data collection in order for that to be standardized. So then it can be applied into the ML models. A very short last question, what kind of computation power are we talking about here? So is GPU or TPU good enough to solve the real life challenges, or are we still waiting for quantum? What's the order of magnitude needed here for really deliver some valuable insights from your perspective, from your background.
I can have a go, but perhaps pass to others quickly. I mean, I think we're doing pretty well with what we've got. I think we have to always use what we have access to, and that's been happening, as we've said, for decades.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously, you know, for quantum, it offers huge potential, and certainly some of the grander challenges that we have out there could be achieved, but there's enough compute. I think it still comes back to this issue of data and data quality and data breadth and the reproducibility of science. So we can make good sense with what we've got without waiting for quantum computing.
The second section we have for today, the second topic, let me very quickly share the screen, is the challenges, right? So from the domain perspective, the life science is basically about human and human life, as it says. So of course, the largest problems is basically people dying for many reasons, or people aging as well. That's, I guess, two very, very important topics and challenges that exist and are really important to be solved. There is, of course, the entire development of drugs, but it's very, very time consuming and expensive. So that's another high level challenge for the life science field in general. And the last one that probably covers the initial three is trying to better understand the world in the nanoscale, the biological world, probably also maybe using some either statistical methods or machine learning methods. So in this section, I'd like to start with Elia. From your perspective, from your background, what are the challenges right now that are really, really crucial in the life science world that you feel that can match with AI in general? What teams, what companies are working on right now trying to solve and are really, really crucial for them?
So, you know, I don't want to claim that I'm kind of like an industry expert to give you an overview of the general landscape, but what I found fascinating in the past couple of years is how literally everyone quickly switched over to COVID-19. So people that were working on cancer, on aging, on heart disease, on everything, right? That's where the money was, that's where the urgency was, and literally you could not get into a lab if you were not working on COVID-19. So what that kind of showed, I think, is that there are some general principles that once you have them and once you are specialized in certain aspect of those, whether it's doing the experiments to generate data, analyzing data, interpreting that data and applying it to some domain, that is going to be very valuable at a certain time. Now, if you ask the majority of the people that were in the field of infectious diseases, many companies left the vaccine stage. Many labs around the world that were dealing with these kinds of infections, they were complaining about not having funding and not really having the resources to do this kind of research. All of a sudden, they became superstars. I mean, I know of people that we worked together with that went, you know, from being some obscure lab in a university to all of a sudden being on television every day because that was the need. So the landscape of communicable diseases, I think, is changing very rapidly, and there's going to be ups and downs in terms of attention and funding and things like that. Chronic diseases, I think that there are kind of like luxury applications, like aging, in my opinion, personal view, but I think there's a lot of exciting companies obviously working on in that field. But nevertheless, there is going to be, I think, a separation between Western and kind of third world and developing countries. And, you know, cancer is a good example. I think infectious diseases of different types are good examples. There are many examples of how differently things are. And I think that's why companies that are solving these global challenges on scale are going to be very different from biotechnology companies that are focused on very specific niches. In terms of data science and kind of how do people get into this field, what I've realized is, maybe to follow up on what Nick mentioned, data is available in public repositories, or you can buy data, or you can develop methods to generate your own data. Having that unique kind of a data set, I think, is one of your entry points to doing something special. What I have personal experience in the infectious disease field is how different it is to go from kind of experimental, your lab at the university stage, to preclinical and then getting something into the market. And so that preclinical stage of validation, I think it's lacking a lot of detailed phenotypic data. And we have a lot of depth on the molecular side, right? There's a lot of next generation sequencing. There's a lot of all kinds of detailed single cell data and things like that. What we don't have is the same level of detail at the preclinical stage for phenotypic data. And that's really some gap that we cannot easily cross. I think there are some interesting approaches to try to address that gap. That includes high throughput imaging for animal models, that includes organoids, that includes kind of modeling to try to link the two worlds. But there's definitely a gap there. One of the projects we're involved in is the high throughput imaging of animal models. We've seen a lot of interest from the aging community, from the cancer community, from the infectious disease community. But I think that, you know, there are some gaps. And if you think of an approach as a researcher, like what you're doing, right? You're kind of surveying the landscape and trying to identify where are the gaps. If I were a data science, what is the problem that I would try to solve? I see that as a very important gap that needs solutions. There is integration that is vertical, you know, multi-omics, let's say, integration. And then there's horizontal,
Yes.
right? How do you integrate cell line, animal model, and patients? Like, how do you build that bridge between what you discover in the lab and how it's actually going to work? So both of those areas, I think, are very important gaps that still exist.
So you can say that there is data silos in the domain, and having something to integrate across these silos, plus looking for correlations between these silos.
Correlation here is a problematic word because a lot of correlation does not translate to actual useful information. But yes, some connection between those worlds is needed.
Perfect. So let me pass this question to Nick. So Nick, from your perspective, 2021 and beyond, what are the biggest challenges right now that either big pharma, like big companies, are trying to solve, or the, say, public funded research universities are also tackling at the moment and are really, really urgent?
Obviously, the infectious disease area is still prominent because of what could happen over the next few years, but maybe looking at some of the other therapeutic areas, I think the research continues in both in an oncology sense, but also across more societal issues around diseases caused by poor diet and the cardiovascular type area as well. So I would say that it's still going to be continuing and expanding the work that we've got, but basically trying to use as much data as we can that we're capturing around observational data and precision data that we're bringing in as more and more people are sequenced, and we're using the biobanks to help us with that. So I see it more of continuing at pace with what we're doing, but trying to bring in the continued learning of the evolution of AI, as well as the ability to create more quality data during the experimental workflow, whether that be in an in vitro, in vivo sense, but also ensuring that the data that we collect in electronic health records are much more mineable, because there's huge value there, but there's a huge effort needed to make that data meaningful and comparable with other data. I think we're just going to see continued at pace activity around improving the quality of the data, because as we build out those pipelines, we'll have much better. We're collecting enough data, I think, with the growth of sequencing, as we've said, but it's just making more use of it in the right therapeutic areas and bringing it together. I mean, the observational, we're involved a bit in the Odyssey workflow, and that's a huge activity around a standardized data model and using the best approaches to sort of ontologies as well in terms of standardization. And there's huge value there, but it's still, there's a lot of unmet need that once we get more data into the OMOP standard and CDM, then we'll be at a much better advantage in terms of asking the questions that we want to ask of the data.
Yeah, so as a follow-up here, I feel that was also in a response from Ilya, is there is this entire group of topics which are basically trying to cure diseases, and there are certain groups of diseases, but from the other standpoint, we also have more fascinating research in understanding aging, because there's this theory that actually if you solve aging, that you the same time you're solving the diseases. So my question here is, what is the perspective for the next, say, 5 or 10 years for the humanity in general to understand the reasons behind aging, and from there trying to slow it down, stop it, or reverse it? Is that possible?
I'd love to hear what Vikram says about aging. What is aging?
Okay, so maybe that's for Vikram as well.
I'm not an aging researcher, so I'm not really sure I can comment on this at all. My understanding of the field, which is pretty limited, is essentially that anti-aging research is mostly right now focused on the biological stage in terms of understanding what the key drivers of aging are. And we are still very, very far away from developing drugs that could tackle aging in any real sense.
So maybe
I think one of the interesting definitions of aging, just to kind of add to what Vikram added, is that aging is really a biological phenomena that is different from your actual age, right? So I think one of the misconceptions that I had when I hear people, working on aging is, let's make people live until 200 years old. I think definitely that is probably out of reach at the moment. But if you think of aging as a problem of biological system degradation that is causing loss of quality of life and more risk to disease and all kinds of weakened responses and things like that, I think then it really kind of boils down from this name, let's solve aging, to really back to what we were talking about, right? Let's figure out a way to, boost the immune system and address all kinds of aging related problems like cancer, right? So, I mean, I'm not sure that there's a very clear definition right now between aging per se and some of the other areas that people have been working on for a very long time.
So maybe to have a step back from aging into where it comes from. In general, it comes from a better understanding of overall what is happening on a very, very tiny nanoscale level. So my question here is, if this is difficult basically to understand what is happening in the cell, on a cell level, or in human organisms in general, do you feel any place where machine learning can help and boost the research on such a small scale? Is that helpful to, or not, from your perspective, Vikram?
I'd say this is the area machine learning is probably being applied the most in biology, to understand how molecules interact with proteins, to understand how proteins fold and how proteins interact with each other, and to draw correlations between certain genes being mutated and larger disease phenotypes. I'm biased here as a structural biologist. This is the sort of thing that I work on the most, which is why I'm also the most exposed to it. But I think it's the area that has seen the most machine learning. The key challenge here essentially is distinguishing correlations that you cannot easily identify through any deep learning approach from causations that are actually useful for treating diseases. It's very, very easy to identify lots and lots of genes that correlate with any disease phenotype that you care about. It's much more difficult to distinguish which genes do you actually cause certain disease phenotypes, and which genes just happen to be correlated because of many different confounding factors that show up in these sorts of data sets. And there are similar problems across pretty much every problem you would want to solve with machine learning that we don't really have a great way of solving right now.
Okay, so as a rule of thumb, it's a good approach. It makes sense to start from the bottom and go up. So to understand how atoms interact, how the small molecules are combined into larger molecules. However, there are many challenges both in the domain field and in the data field. Is that correct? Is that correct understanding?
Yeah, I won't say that it is necessarily the best approach to start from the bottom up. It depends a lot on the disease you're working on, the sorts of data that you have available. But for many diseases, it's an approach that will allow you to both better understand the science behind the disease and have a better chance of your drug actually working in a clinical trial.
Amazing. So I have one more question for you to answer one by one, and then we're gonna switch to the panel mode. So let's very quickly go through the third question. I feel it somehow was already answered, so we can quickly jump here because the title of our today's webinar is drug discovery to be specific. And you can think of drug discovery as a big pipeline where you on the left hand, you have this 5,000, 10,000 compounds to research. And at the end of the day, you have the new drug. So very quick round of question here. Is machine learning helping and can it really accelerate the discovery of new drugs? And if yes, what's the best way to start learning more about this? This question I'd like to start with Nick.
Thank you. I think it's having an impact at certain points of the workflow. And obviously, there are different efforts, whether that be right at the earlier stage, as Vikram has said, and equally later stage, if anything, where the effort should be focused at the moment, the last stages of drug discovery into development are often the most costly. So things, I think, active efforts around, patient recruitment and the whole design of clinical trials is often the bit that takes the longest and can be the most risky part as well as the most expensive part. So ways that whole area can be improved is already happening, both from an operational sense, just simply trying to do easier and more efficient patient recruitment. So it doesn't all have to be about the design of new molecules. There are other bits of the drug discovery and drug development workflow which can be just, if anything, more amenable to early stage AI ML than some of the more complicated parts, which may need more data and may need better understanding. So I think we have to be pragmatic about, there was a really good paper that Andreas Bender, I think, co-authored with one of his colleagues at Cambridge a few months ago, which looked at this cycle of where is the biggest bang for your buck really. And it did point to this sort of later stage usage as being perhaps where we should focus first. But certainly there are key things going on at the design stage of the drug entity, the drug modality, as well as the things, as we've heard, as Elia has mentioned, around animal models and so on, because all of those, it's not going to be one place, it's going to be the combination and the progress in different areas, which when put together improves both the cycle time as well as the quality of the drug candidates. I think it's those two metrics which will have the biggest impact, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a big sense. I feel that there's probably a separate webinar. So Vikram, a question to you. If a drug discovery, if you think about this as a big challenge, what are the most important sub-challenges to tackle with AI from your perspective?
I'll just echo what Nick says. I think the most important sub-challenge is at the clinical trial stage. Success rates of clinical trials vary depending on the disease you go after, but they're generally somewhere in the 10 to 15% range, which is very low given how expensive a clinical trial is and how long they take. And if we can improve that success rate, either by filtering out compounds that don't work before they reach a clinical trial using machine learning, or by identifying better compounds or any other method, then that would dramatically change the drug discovery landscape as a whole, just by making it cheaper to run clinical trials to get a successful drug. The other thing I'll mention is that this model that we've seen is most specific for small molecule drugs, which are a significant portion of the drug market, but definitely not the only drug out there. So for example, I'm working on protein drugs right now, which behave somewhat differently. For example, you don't screen for them in the same ways. And there are lots of other modalities of drugs out there that could potentially benefit from machine learning applications as well.
So here also a very quick follow-up. As we've seen in the COVID situation, the whole vaccination wouldn't be as quick if there was not a big amount of research actually prior the entire pandemic. So failed clinical trials or any failed screening, can you think of that as actually valuable data that you can explore and then redesign or like cross-design slightly different drugs for new purposes? Is that a data set to reutilize, recycle again and again, or that's just a failed experiment and you need to start from scratch?
Nick,
Vikram.
You could certainly use the data from a failed clinical trial. For example, remdesivir was resurrected from a failed trial before it became an anti-COVID drug. But It's probably the most expensive way for you to get data because you're
Mhm.
literally running data on humans, and clinical trials are incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
So if you could get data some other way that would have similar impact and give you the similar amount of information, you would probably prefer to do that.
Yeah, I'm not trying to evangelize to run failed clinical trials. I'm just thinking if there've been so much money spent already, can we just reutilize what already happened in past and then try to figure out the, say, new drugs from that data that already is there? Is that a good approach from your perspective?
Sorry, were you going to say something?
I was going to agree, sorry, I was going to agree, but also say that I think any data should be usable. It's just about using it in the right context. I mean, I think that's the problem with negative data doesn't get as reported as much as positive data. And I think that's a culture change that we have to modify really to make more value, because AI, if anything, has probably got more power in it to make more of negative data than we as humans do. So I think we do need to be much better at reusing, whether it be early experimental failures as well as later stage data in clinical trials. But sorry, I interrupted you, Vikram.
Yeah, I think you were going to say something pretty similar to what I was going to say. I think there's certainly valuable information in failed clinical trials, but unfortunately, they're just not published as often as they should be.
Oh,
so
okay.
It might be hard to gather all of that.
Okay, that's a different challenge. It would be expensive to buy. I didn't thought about that. So Elia, from your perspective, where do you see the best application for machine learning, artificial intelligence, specifically in drug discovery processes? From your background, which problem is the easiest or the first to try to tackle?
Well, I'd like to kind of build on what both Nick and Vikram actually mentioned is the opportunity in terms of business sense. So what really makes sense for a pharmaceutical company is not what makes sense to a biotechnology company and is not what makes sense to a student. If you're a student and you're trying to learn data science and application to life science challenges, clinical trials is not the place to get started. If you're a biotechnology company that is focused on a very specific domain, that probably is a good place to start from failed clinical trials, because you can learn a lot about what other people have tried and what came out of that. If you're a pharmaceutical company, all of these are focused on very different volume, very different types of costs, and very different types of things that they could do with the insights that they generate from this data. So again, I think it's a business problem. And that's a part that I think is integral to all of these discussions about, biology is important to understand, data is important to understand, but also the business part of it here is critical. So I know that the way people are trying to address the clinical trial issue with a lot of clinical trials failing is to leverage better understanding of real world evidence. So kind of what is known from patients that are already out there. If you knew what is happening to a patient much better, and you could then design your clinical trial in a better way, that would be a step forward. If you, of course, have more data coming together with the people that are recruited into the clinical trial, again, that solves the problem. But there's a lot of also issues with that, because data sharing and of accessibility and the privacy of data and the way that data is collected by different institutions that own the data, right? So there's a whole set of challenges that are outside of data science domain, life science domain. They're purely political, ethical, business problems. So if we want to solve a problem that is the low-hanging fruit that could be solved in the next 5 to 10 years, I think that it is very specific to where you are in those, 3 different areas. Are you a student? Are you a research lab? Are you a biotechnology company / pharmaceutical company? And I think that's why it's important to focus on kind of the problems that could be solved with a validation, right? So if you have the ability to test your model by validating it in an experiment, maybe focus on either generating your own data or taking data from the public domain. There are expert labs around the world that are generating thousands of data every day. So take a data set from there. They're experts in generating the data. If you understand it, there's likely a method of analysis that you could apply and extract something useful. If you have already access to patient data and you're trying to learn something useful for your patients, maybe look at clinical trial data and try to understand the gaps. And I think it also has to do with some generalization of what machine learning does. I think machine learning, not only is it hyped up, but it's also such a generalized term. There are many different methods that are, not necessarily categorized as machine learning and could be useful, I think, in application to many different data sets and are used in practice by companies that do this as their primary kind of focus. So again, I think that if the question is, where can we make an impact? I think one of the areas that I would highlight as an important one for us is that together with the understanding of the data and accessibility of the data, you also have to have trained personnel. So people are a key part in every part of the data cycle.
True.
They generate data, they design the experiments, they use the insights from that. And so the more I feel like data science becomes a standard part of education, that every person that gets involved in this field, whether they come from a biological background or a data science background, they're well versed in how data is generated, what does it represent biologically, but also what can these methods of analysis produce, the more outcome we will get ultimately in the end. So that's just my perspective.
Yeah, it sounds that really deserves a subsequent episode. So the last topic we have for today, very quick, your votes for the hottest trends in the field of drug discovery in general. So what you feel is gonna happen in the next couple of years? I think that was partially mentioned. So just if you want to add something more to this topic. So we're just trying to discover the trends. What do you see from your background is going to happen and be a major research breakthrough or major business breakthrough? Maybe costs of drug development, they will decrease. And let's start with Elia, because I know you have the least time.
Thank you. I think mRNA vaccines showed how quickly we can get to a functional product really quickly. I think a really exciting example is in silico medicine, what they've been doing with training their networks, kind of specialized. I mean, Google AlphaFold, right? So prediction of a problem that's been around for a long time and a big challenge. So there are great examples of where machine learning and AI is changing the way that things are working. I think still there are many different challenges that are going to remain. And again, I think that the important thing here to reduce the time and reduce the cost is the integration of data. I think training people and really kind of enabling more people to utilize data science and with an understanding of life sciences. I think there's also a lack of interoperability, really kind of linking the different data sets together. They have to become more standardized, and that just has to do with general data practices. I think this was an exciting discussion. There are many areas that we've touched upon that require much more in-depth kind of review and discussion to discover these patterns. But it was really great to hear from everyone. So thank you once again for inviting me.
Yeah, Nick, do you want to add to that? Is it possible that you quickly jump on this?
Well, I mean, I think just building on that, I would say it's about the data, comes back to the data and particularly the observational data. So the ability to use late stage data for feeding back into the earlier cycles. So that, yeah, that's what I would push.
Amazing. I just want to mention before jumping to Vikram is that both Elia and Nick are running companies. So Elia is running Pine Biotech and Nick is running Cool Research. So I do recommend to check out the cool stuff that you guys are building. There wasn't enough time to go through what you are actually working on, what kind of problems you are solving, but I feel that there might be an opportunity to discuss in the later episodes. But I do recommend to all that are listening to us to check out Pine Biotech and Cool Research. There will be links to that as well. And right now, Vikram, so for your types, your hopes, where do you feel what's going to happen in a couple of next years as a major breakthrough by utilizing this machine learning in life sciences? What are your types?
This is not machine learning, but I'll echo Elliot's point about RNA vaccines having a major impact in the near future. So that's almost obvious now. I think machine learning for early stage drug discovery, especially like hit identification, lead optimization, and anything maybe preclinical stage, will start having a major impact across small molecule and protein modalities over the next few years, because that's where we've seen most of the research so far. I also think there will be more impact in machine learning on target identification and personalized therapies, especially for diseases like cancer that tend to be very heterogeneous. Those are the two major areas I've seen the most research in so far, and those are the areas that I think will have the most impact immediately.
Yeah, and as it was mentioned before, the entire COVID situation just was, if we can use these words, a great marketing for utilizing data science in solving important life sciences problems. So I hope now the society in general, we understand how important that is and how quickly we can get to some meaningful results. Hopefully there will be also more trust in society into this, because this situation is not the easiest to gain trust because it's special. But we hope that there will be not just a cure for COVID, but there will be more understanding in cures for any type of infectious diseases thanks to this situation. So always looking for the good potential good outcomes of this situation, and that's probably one of this. So I just quickly want to sum up. Thank you, our amazing and thoughtful panelists, for your expertise. I do feel that we only tackled the top of an iceberg, so hopefully we can have some follow-up sessions. For all the questions that we received, we're gonna follow up in probably LinkedIn comments, because there wasn't time to, but we hope that we're gonna address them as well. So thanks you once again, all the panelists, all the attendees. This video will always be like available for you to watch later. So if that's helpful, you can share it and help us grow with more episodes.